You're standing in a small warehouse in the Netherlands, surrounded by stacks of books that a bookseller thought someone was pranking him about. I'm Jacob, and I cover the systems no one talks about. In 2023, a Dutch antiquarian bookseller received what looked like a completely ordinary order: 3,000 copies of a single out-of-print book, a request so unusual and so sudden that he assumed it had to be spam, or worse, some kind of phishing attempt. Let me set the scene more precisely because the details matter here. The bookseller's name is not widely known outside of small publishing circles, but his shop exists in that particular ecosystem where rare books, used copies, and out-of-print editions circulate. One day in early 2023, he received an inquiry asking for 3,000 copies of a specific book. Not a few dozen, not hundreds. 3,000. To put that in perspective, most out-of-print books have a circulation in the dozens, maybe low hundreds, if they were moderately successful decades ago. The query came through what looked like a standard book distribution channel, but the number itself triggered something in his mind. He had seen bots before. He had seen fake orders. 3,000 copies felt like a test, like someone was scanning to see if his system was real or automated. So he did what any careful business owner would do. He declined. He marked it as suspicious. He moved on. What he didn't know, and what took months to understand, was that someone, or some organization, had been very serious, and they would simply go somewhere else to find those books. Here's where the story expands outward, and where you need to understand what actually happened in the time after that declined order. Internet Archive, the non-profit organization that has been digitizing books since 1996, found itself at the center of an unusual situation. The organization, founded by digital librarian Brewster Cayley, had spent decades building what might be the most comprehensive digital library on Earth. By the early 2020s, Internet Archive housed millions of digitized texts, many of them scanned from library collections, from donations, from the public domain. But in 2023 and into 2024, something began to shift. Researchers and publishers started noticing that large language model companies, the corporations building tools like GPT-4, like Claude, like other competitors in that space, were systematically accessing and downloading massive collections of books from these publicly available repositories. Not just browsing them, not just sampling them, downloading them in bulk, processing them, extracting text, and feeding them into training datasets. The Dutch bookseller's declined order had been part of a larger pattern. Book talk had made people want certain titles. Nostalgia had driven demand for others. But what most collectors and booksellers didn't realize was that the same titles were being vacuumed up by automated systems, indexed, copied, and transformed into training data. OpenAI's systems, Anthropic's systems, Google's systems. The question of exactly which companies did this, and exactly when they started, became blurred because so much of this process happens in private infrastructure, in data centers that don't announce what they're processing. Now we arrive at the legal and ethical machinery that makes this story real and urgent. In the United States, copyright law has what's called fair use doctrine. Fair use theoretically allows companies to use copyrighted material in limited ways, particularly for transformation, criticism, education, or research. Machine learning companies have argued, and continue to argue, that training their models on copyrighted text falls under this umbrella of fair use. They are transforming the text into something new, they claim. They are not republishing the books, they are extracting patterns and knowledge. The counter-argument, made by publishers, by authors, and by a growing number of legal scholars, is that this interpretation stretches fair use far beyond its original intent. In 2023 and 2024, lawsuits began to emerge. Authors like Sarah Silverman, authors like Michael Chabon, joined class action suits against OpenAI and Meta, arguing that their work had been used without permission and without compensation. These cases have not yet been fully resolved, and as of late 2024, many are still winding through courts. But the books themselves kept being scanned, kept being downloaded, kept being processed. The Dutch bookseller's experience was not an anomaly. Publishers across Europe and North America reported similar stories, orders that seemed designed to acquire as many copies of specific titles as possible with no intention of reselling them. Orders that came from institutional buyers that didn't quite check out. Some of these orders, when investigated, did trace back to organizations building training datasets for machine learning systems. Others were deliberately obscured, routed through intermediaries, hidden behind corporate structures designed to keep the origin of the request private. What started as a single bookseller marking an order as spam had become evidence of something much larger. A shadow market for copyrighted material, a systematic effort to acquire and process books for AI training without going through the authors, without paying royalties, without asking permission. To understand why this was possible, you have to understand how book distribution actually works and how it's changed. For decades, the book supply chain was relatively stable and transparent. Publishers sold to distributors. Distributors sold to bookstores and libraries. Libraries and bookstores sold used copies through secondary markets. But the internet, and particularly the rise of aggregated marketplaces, fractured that chain into thousands of smaller channels. Someone can now find almost any book through reseller networks, through book marketplaces like Abe Books, through library sale websites, through estate sale services. These marketplaces have very little friction. They move quickly. They operate on thin margins. They don't ask a lot of questions about who is buying or why. They just process the transaction. So if you are a company that wants to acquire, say, 5,000 copies of out-of-print textbooks from the 1980s, you can do it. You can do it by spreading the orders across multiple marketplaces, multiple distributors, multiple resellers. You can do it quietly. You can do it in ways that don't trigger alarm bells at any single point in the chain. The bookseller in the Netherlands had been one point in that chain. He'd caught one order. But for every order that was declined or questioned, probably dozens went through without a single person noticing anything unusual. The infrastructure exists. The demand is enormous. AI companies need text, enormous quantities of text, to train their systems. Books, particularly out-of-print books that are no longer generating revenue for their publishers or authors, are an easy source. They sit in warehouses, they sit in library sales, they sit in the inventory of thousands of small booksellers, completely unaware that they are being quietly acquired as raw material for something they didn't consent to. And once those books left the supply chain, once they entered those training datasets, something else happened. The books themselves were, in effect, destroyed. Not physically destroyed, but their contents were encrypted, compressed, abstracted into mathematical vectors. The original text was no longer readable in any conventional sense. What remained was only its distilled essence, mixed with millions of other books, inseparable from the rest of the dataset. The author's original work still existed, legally and physically, but the information it contained, the knowledge it held, had been extracted, copied, and redistributed as part of something else entirely. That Dutch bookseller never did fulfill that order of 3,000 copies. He declined it, he forgot about it, and he moved on. But what he didn't know at the time was that the same information, extracted through other channels, was already on its way into the machine. It was already being processed. It was already being transformed. The question of who owns knowledge, who gets paid when knowledge is used, and what it means to copy something in the digital age remains unsolved. And it remains unsolved because the infrastructure that makes it possible was built to be invisible. In our next video, we're going to examine another infrastructure, another system that was built to be invisible, but for a very different reason. We're going to look at what happened in 1903 when one of the most powerful inventors in American history tried to solve a problem that would have changed everything. We're going to talk about Thomas Edison, his electric car battery, and why it disappeared,